Okay, welcome to this section I'm calling Space Allocation as it relates to the CMS Cost Report, tracking your square footage changes. I wanted to add this section. I placed it in the competencies, well, it almost seems like 2 years ago, um, because one of the things that comes up every year for those facilities that have Medicaid patients is that they have to update or deal with or address square footages by departments. You take your whole facility and you need to ensure that all your square footages are correct. And I wanted to, I put that in there because it was one of those things where, again, one of the things we're trying to do in this course and in our profession is to become professionals and to be proactive. Also, we talk an awful lot about having a connection with the C-suite. And as we probably know, or as we should know, one of the most important relationships to have, and again, they're all extremely important, but is to have a good relationship with your CFO, your financial folks, and your financial officer. And at the end of the day, I think that when you look at the balance of money and customer service and quality and patience, if we had to sit there and say in our industry from experience, what what's really the most important thing in many organizations, it would be the finances. Um, I know that we can get out of kilter when it comes to finances. I know that often it sways and sometimes it can dilute or it can lead us down a path that we, too much. We can lose focus, I should say, sometimes on quality or employee work life or even the patient and safety. But while we always have to keep that in check and all that in balance, I think all things work together. And I think this particular subject is one of those things where, again, I just really want you as HFL future professionals not to be caught unaware or off guard and to develop process and systems to address this issue, albeit one of those minor issues sometimes to us in a more proactive way. So, we're doing this in here at this point because A is a competency, B because we're talking about closing out projects, and we're talking about what happens at the end, some of the things. And I think this is one that can get lost. It can get lost, and then it comes back to us later. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So, what is the CMS cost report? Well, for those, again, I mentioned earlier, for those that are tied to Medicare reimbursement, the cost of report is very important. What it essentially does is it takes each department that bills for Medicare, and they do use a calculation to determine what's your overhead. In other words, what does it cost for you to run that department? And as you know, when it comes to cost, one of the big costs we have for our facilities is what? Is utilities. We talk about that all the time. Well, how are you going to allocate utilities? Every department doesn't have a meter, although I think that would be a really good idea. And in fact, we're probably getting to the point here with digital technology that we may be able to more realistically apply, utilities to every department with as cheap as sensors are getting and meters are getting. But while that's really not practical, what's the cost of a department? And that can also change by equipment. I mean, some departments can be extremely energy intensive. Although for the Medicare cost report, it really doesn't necessarily always pick up that sensitivity. Again, this may be an area where we could get even greater returns on our expenses if we did meter certain departments, because we know that certain departments like radiology, for example, they probably use more energy than almost any department in the hospital. You could argue surgery and you could argue maybe laboratory, but those areas maybe we should, as facilitators, we should get more involved with that energy number so they can calculate the expense to run those departments. But generally speaking, what we do is we take the square footage and we take our utility bills and we apply kind of a straight, line to it, a linear line. And again, there's other costs. For example, environmental services is shared across the organization. Maintenance costs are shared across an organization. Security costs are shared across an organization. Materials management costs. So what happens is the way this is done is that all of these support departments, essentially, they're tallied up, their expenses and everything, and then they use the square footage to drive the cost per department. Again, I'm sure as you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, wow, is that the best method? And there are other methods, and you can use other methods, although for the sake of simplicity and the sake of um, just getting it done, this is a universal method that is used. Although I'm sure Medicaid, Medicare will listen to other methods that are well thought out or well documented and done. And so that's why it's done, and it's done annually. It's updated at a certain time of the year. What you'll have is it's typically, I believe, it's late in the spring, around May or June, and so somewhere around February or so, or January, February, maybe March, you'll get something from someone in accounting saying, hey, we need the square footages for all the department. And typically that's what happens. And I can tell you candidly, I didn't always know why they needed it, and there were times where we had very few projects going on. It was no big deal. But there were times where we had done many, many projects and many, many, many moves. It was a major, major headache. And that's kind of the reason why I'm bringing this up. You may have a health system that this is not even done at the facility manager level. Maybe it's done at some engineering, architectural, design firm level where they keep track of it. I don't know how many organizations have that luxury, but in my guesstimation, I'm saying it's probably very few. I'm going to say that most departments have to deal with these things down to the at facility manager level or director level, and when it's done, they don't necessarily have it updated as things move along. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. Just, a little bit more is I want to talk about that next, and that is, well, why us again? Why do we get that responsibility? Well, we're tied to the projects, and we're tied to the moves, and one could say we own the drawings. And again, this does vary facility by facility, but some people, or very few people, have someone at some master level that's managing these drawings for us. There are, again, a few that are, but most of us, we have to manage these drawings. And and we all talk about how important it is to have updated drawings. We say this all the time. Well, here's one more reason, and it's a cost reason. And it's also an opportunity here to engage your CFO or your financial people to maybe even free up some dollars to ensure you get updated drawings. I mean, maybe they just think that we can just whip these things up really quickly, but from my experience, I can tell you sometimes this can be extremely a painstaking event, especially if you do it well. And that's the other side of this coin. I have found that a lot of people don't do it well. This pay now or pay later conversation. What I found is when I stepped into my roles at my two facilities, is that really a lot of lip service was being given to this effort. No one really went out and truly measured, or for that matter, what I often found out through this process it's just how far off many departments' square footages were, or how far off some of our drawings were that we had. Because as I sent staff out to measure spaces, it'd be amazing what we find out about spaces. Now, those of you who are working in newer technologies and newer hospitals or have BIM, things like that are really modern and updated, you don't have these issues, at least right now, until many, many iterations and changes come. But you'll find out that, if you take this seriously, especially the first time, it takes a lot of effort to get these square footages right. And then you get into some really big questions. For example, think about waiting areas. Who gets waiting areas, especially if they're shared by multiple departments? That gets a little bit confusing. Someone has to make a decision on that. There's also, the great big blob of space that is called administration. These are support areas. Very often your meeting rooms, your hallways. Again, some hallways go to just the administrative section, and then you get into the very interesting question of how many square feet does facilities actually owns. Maintenance and operations, we have a lot of square footage beyond just the maintenance shop or beyond the plant. You start getting into these mechanical spaces and these mechanical rooms and some of these access areas, and next thing you know, you're finding out that, wow, maintenance has quite a bit of square footage, and then all the other support departments. So it is a great exercise to get to know your square footage of your building more accurately. It's also a great exercise to know what departments own what. And what you'll find is, some departments, they get a little bit ouchy about square footage because they recognize that the more square footage they have, the more overhead they own. And with the more overhead they own, you'll find then, guess what? Their profit margin starts to go down. And for some departments, it doesn't really matter. They're going to be the revenue generators, or they need the space and they don't even think about it. But you'll find there are other departments that are on the edge, if you will, of existence due to profitability or lack of profitability, that they get very, very excited about these square footages. Who's in what office in their area. I mean, I've had areas where, and we've all seen it, where you'll have a department where, you'll have some people that's occupying space in their unit or their floor, and these people have nothing to do with their unit or their floor. And I've had directors, who understand this cost reporting mechanism, who have spent time in my office explaining to me that they want to be sure that that office or that space is not allocated to them. And then you get into the next big issue related to cost reporting and square footage, and that is, how long have they been there? I mean, and I don't actually have an answer for this. I usually refer to the accounting department. If somebody just moved in a month ago, or somebody moved in a year ago, or someone moved in 6 months ago, and also what if the space is unoccupied, things like that. So I'd like to tell you that, this is a really cookie cutter, easy thing. And to be candid, if you just kind of gun deck it and just paper whip it, it can be. But this is a very serious issue for organizations when it comes to their finances, and that's why I'm bringing it up. Especially, and it's getting more serious because people are getting better at it, and the expectations are growing. And really, at the end of a project, and that's really what this slide is about. Complete as the project happens or close. That is ideally the way it should happen. I mean, as you make a move, as you change an area, your square footages should change. They should be dated. Everybody should know when it was. What square footage has been allocated to whom should be clear, and your drawings should be updated. For a lot of us, this is on paper. We don't have the luxury of an electronic or a person who's working in CAD that we just slip them, some information and they update the drawing. A lot of us, it's actually taking, paper, making copies, and then going in and editing it manually, which is pretty much what I did. I mean, if you saw my documents for this, I had very specific drawings for just this activity, and they were highlighted in many, many, many different. I had multiple highlight pencils that I would take and I would use to highlight spaces and document who was in what space. So, if I was really, really on my game, I was doing it as it went. But candidly, most times what happened was we kept track of our projects, we went through our facility, and we updated the drawings at the end of the year. Now, I was fortunate too, I didn't have a super large facility either, especially my second facility, but I can only imagine what this would be like for a very large facility where there's many, many moves going on and many, many, many projects going on in that facility. So, you could catch it up at the end of the year, but you have a method to your madness. It can be done fairly simply, especially if you not have a lot of projects. That makes it even better. But you got to have initial good drawings, and that's really the nutshell of this conversation is those drawings. Again, another reason to have excellent drawings, another reason to engage your financing people. And again, like I said earlier, this is an opportunity for you to have that conversation with your finance folks and say, hey, maybe we ought to get someone to come in here and get us, to go through a contractor to come in and get these drawings perfect and put them into a software that we can use so that I can stay on top of this. And now you have an excellent tool to stay on this. And this is a good opportunity to get buy-in from your staff, because again, they're out there on the front line. I mean, I actually, I thought that some of the staff really enjoyed doing this sometimes, sending them out and saying, hey, we need to update these drawings. And at the end there, I certainly turned it over to them and said, here's the drawings, here's the mission, I've got good foundations. We've had about 10 changes going up. redo those measurements and come back in and update these drawings. And it took me a long time to kind of let that process go, but it's something that again, just knowing ahead of time it's there and it exists and you need to do it, I think is half the battle. Getting the processes in place and making it happen is the other half, and then just being consistent is the rest of the story. So that's the end of the section. I have a couple of things for you to read this week that kind of help reinforce this conversation. And again, I hope this is one of those little nuances to our industry that is helpful. And I also hope that you're going to take this to the next level, on day one. And that's one of the mottos of this program is different day one. Walking in and just knowing this stuff versus having to react to it and learn it over time. That's the end of the presentation.